years ago, I gave my first, or one of my speeches about my first triathlon. And as I explained the whole process of how I entered the race and swam and came out of the swim and was real tired, and then jumped on my bike and rode for 18 miles and got off my bike and was real tired, and then ran 6 miles after that and was real tired, and then I thanked the audience and walked off stage. And I didn't know then that everybody walked out of there and probably within minutes or hours had forgotten what I said or what I spoke about because I didn't have a conclusion. I didn't tell about my experience or summarize what I had just gone through. So today, I will teach you all and give you some tips on concluding your speech so that as you leave, the audience remembers what you spoke about. And that's the most important part. Because if you come up here and you stand up here for 10 minutes, you want them to remember what you said. So there are 4 criteria to make a successful conclusion. The first one is achieve a sense of closure. And that means when you're giving your speech and you come to your conclusion part, tell them it's the conclusion. In closing, I would like to say, concluding, finally. So that this draws the audience in and they realize, all right, now this is the final points. Summarize your main points. Go back and say, this is what I spoke about. The first item, the second item, the third item. Make an impact. Tell them the importance of what you just spoke about. And then finally, do that in 5 to 10% of your speech. So if your speech is 10 minutes long, use only a minute or a minute and a half to summarize your speech. And those are the 4 criteria in concluding your speech. Now what I'll give you is some tips on how to do that, how to make that closing. The first one can be a quotation. A quotation is a good use of language that will help people remember your speech down as they leave and they're gone on days and weeks and months beyond. So if you were making a speech about giving a speech about how you can encourage people to get involved in the community, get involved in a philanthropic foundation, you could end your speech with a quotation like Kennedy's inaugural speech, ask not what you can do for your country, but ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So as your audience walks out of the speech, they're reminded of, all right, not what I can do for my community, or what my community can do for me, but what I can do. They're reminded about your speech from that quote. The second tip is tell a story. A story is a great way to remind people about your speech. If you're giving a speech on financial planning, you can tell a simple story about the ant and the grasshopper. It's a very simple story. Everybody knows it. It's something that everybody can remember. The ant saves up his whole life, and he's at the end of his retirement, he's got a big nest egg. The grasshopper fooled around, and at the end of his life, or at his retirement, he's got nothing. The third way is call for action. If you do a persuading speech, make your call for action clear. It's real important that you do that in a way that the audience will remember that call for action. Another tip on making a successful closing is ask a rhetorical question. If I were to give a speech describing the financial crisis and ways to improve that, prevent that from happening again, I could end that speech with, follow these tips. Can we really afford another financial crisis? So that's something that everybody will remember. Two real simple tips. Follow this. Refer back to the beginning of your speech. is probably one of the simplest tips to concluding your speech. When you start your speech, your introduction usually says, "Today I'm going to speak about ABC." Wrap that all back in. In concluding, I told you I was going to speak about ABC. It's the simplest form to begin your conclusion. And finally, summarize your main points. That's a real simple technique. This morning I told you I was going to speak about how to conclude your speech. I told you I was going to talk about tips. I told you the criteria. I told you I was going to give you some tips. And finally, I'm going to give you the main points of concluding your speech. So they're real simple ideas. Lastly, some real simple tips for success in concluding your speech. Memorize your conclusion. It should only be about a minute, so it should be very simple to memorize. End on time. Oftentimes when you're speaking and your speech goes over, what gets cut off is the end. And that's the most important part. So work real hard on ending your speech on time so that you have time to get your conclusion in there. And then finally, refrain from adding new points. So if you're giving your speech and you realized at the very end that you've forgotten to add something that was part of the body of the speech, forget about it. Nobody knows that you left that piece out except for you. So don't try to sneak it in at the end, because then that's a new point that your audience has to remember, and they don't get a sense of conclusion. In conclusion, if you follow these simple tips, remembering the criteria for a closing, using one of the tips that I outlined above, and then using the final tips for closing your speech, you will have a successful speech closing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Please take a few minutes to make some comments for Peter and pass it down to our